I am Mason Caldwell, 43 years old, and for most of my adult life I have made my living listening to other people describe the slow fractures in their marriages, the tiny betrayals that become habits, the resentments that calcify into something sharp. And I have always believed that the worst part of infidelity is not the sex, or even the secret itself, but the way it forces the betrayed person to live in two realities at once. The one everyone sees, and the one that quietly eats you alive. And I did not understand how literal that could feel until the night I found the messages on Lauren's tablet. We live in Portland, Oregon, in a house that looks like stability from the outside. Books on the shelves, framed photos from weekend hikes, a kitchen that always smells faintly like coffee and laundry detergent. And Lauren, 39, has always been good at presenting a bright, competent version of herself. The kind of woman who can run a marketing campaign for a local arts foundation and still remember which neighbor is allergic to dogs and which friend prefers oat milk. And I had spent years telling myself that our life was not perfect, but it was solid. The tablet was on the couch, screen lit, the kind of casual oversight that only happens when someone feels safe, and I was not snooping in the way people imagine snooping, because I had not been looking for proof of anything. I had been looking for a recipe she said she saved, and then a notification banner slid across the top with a name that hit me like a dropped weight: Travis Reed. Travis was not a coworker, not a friend, not some harmless old classmate. Travis was a former client of mine from 3 years ago, a man who sat across from me in my office with his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles went pale, a man who came to me because his wife cheated on him, and he could not stop replaying images in his head, and I remember how carefully I had guided him through the humiliation, how I had taught him to breathe through the panic and separate his self-worth from another person's choices, and I remember discharging him when he stabilized, believing the boundary between my professional world and my personal life was clean, and now his name was glowing on my wife's screen like a deliberate contamination. I tapped the notification with a numb, almost clinical calm, and the message thread opened to hundreds of entries, not a handful, not an awkward flirty exchange that could be explained away, but a dense, continuous record of intimacy built over time, and my mouth went dry as I scrolled and saw the same patterns I've helped other people identify: the gradual escalation, the little emotional confessions that become private rituals, the shared jokes that exclude the spouse, the strategic timing, the late-night check-ins, the morning good luck texts, the line-by-line construction of a second relationship that runs parallel to the first. Travis wrote like a man who knew the language of pain because he had lived in it and because he had been given tools. And the sickening part was that some of those tools had been given by me, and Lauren responded like someone who wanted to be understood so badly she did not care what it cost, telling him she felt unseen sometimes, telling him that talking to him made her feel calm, telling him things I thought belonged to our marriage. And in between the emotional declarations there were references to secrecy that made my stomach twist, little notes about deleting notifications, about keeping the conversation off her phone, about how she was glad I was busy with sessions. And the cruelest detail of all was how often Travis mentioned me by name, not as an abstract husband, but as Mason, with the casual familiarity of someone who knew exactly who I was and exactly how to hurt me. I did not confront Lauren that night, and for a while I could not even move, because my brain kept trying to convert what I was seeing into something less impossible. And then I felt something in me shift, something cold and methodical, the part of me that takes notes during a session, the part of me that watches patterns, the part of me that does not make accusations without documentation. And I started screenshotting. I screenshotted every message I could, every date stamp, every photo, every confession, every moment where they referenced meeting up, every place where Lauren wrote about her life in a way that sounded like a performance. And I sent the images to myself, then backed them up again, then again, because I had seen too many people have their reality erased by a well-timed deletion. Over the next 52 days, I did not touch my wife with affection, not because I was trying to punish her, but because my body would not cooperate with the illusion anymore, because her hand on my shoulder felt like a lie, because her kiss goodbye in the morning felt like a script she could deliver while a different conversation waited in her pocket, and I began living as a man who was both present and absent at once. Lauren kept acting like nothing was wrong. She kept moving through her routines with that effortless charm, asking what my schedule looked like, asking how my sessions went, texting me updates about work meetings and grant deadlines, leaning in for a quick kiss while I stood there with my arms stiff at my sides. And I watched her with a steady, quiet focus that surprised even me, tracking her patterns the way I would track a client's triggers, noting when she took her tablet into the bathroom, when she angled her phone away at the dinner table, when she suddenly stayed late at the office on nights she used to come home early, and every time she smiled at me, I felt the strange pressure of holding two truths in my mouth, the one she offered, and the one I'd saved in screenshots. I documented everything. I organized it by date. I wrote down the time she left the house, the time she claimed she was with coworkers, the way her mood lifted after certain messages. And I did it all while continuing to sit with other couples in my office, listening to them describe betrayal, as if it were a concept I understood from books instead of a weapon currently lodged between my ribs. The discovery happened on a random Thursday in late September, the kind of gray Portland morning that blurs into every other one. When I took a rare day off to finish paperwork at home, because I was behind on case notes and insurance documentation, and Lauren left her tablet on the kitchen island after breakfast, screen still glowing faintly beside her coffee mug. And I remember thinking nothing of it until a notification slid across the top with the words, "You make me feel seen," in a way he never has. And even before I consciously processed the sentence, my body reacted with a tightening in my chest that felt both sharp and clinical. Because as a licensed marriage counselor, I have heard that exact phrasing dozens of times in sessions where emotional boundaries have already been crossed long before anyone admits it. I stood there staring at the notification longer than I would like to admit, aware of the refrigerator humming behind me and the faint smell of toast in the air, and I felt a strange detachment settle over me, the kind that sometimes happens in crisis when your training overrides your impulse. And instead of throwing the tablet across the kitchen or calling her in a rage, I calmly picked it up and unlocked it with the passcode I had known for years, telling myself I was simply confirming what I already understood on a professional level. That language like that does not exist in isolation. The thread opened to nearly 4 months of daily communication, a continuous stream of messages that began innocently enough in early summer with friendly check-ins about how he was doing and how work was going, and I watched the progression unfold like a case study I would assign to graduate students. The slow shift from neutral conversation to shared vulnerability, from casual support to emotional reliance. At first it was small, Travis thanking her for a book recommendation, Lauren telling him she hoped he was sleeping better, references to coping strategies that I recognized because I had once taught them to him in my office. And then gradually the tone changed, the messages growing longer, more personal, less filtered. Lauren describing how exhausted she felt after events at the Arts Foundation, how she sometimes felt like she was performing a version of herself that everyone expected, and Travis responding with empathy that felt practiced, almost curated, telling her she deserved to feel understood, telling her she carried so much alone. As I scrolled, I could feel the shift into something unmistakable, confessions about her fears of aging, about her anxiety that her life had plateaued, about how she sometimes felt lonely even when sitting next to me on the couch, and I recognized the language immediately as attachment-seeking, as emotional transference redirected toward someone outside the marriage. There were lines that felt like precise incisions, Lauren writing that she did not know when she had last felt truly seen, that our conversations had become logistical rather than intimate, that I seemed distant and preoccupied, and Travis responding by validating every insecurity, positioning himself as the safe harbor, the attentive listener, the man who understood her in a way that supposedly I never had. She described feeling invisible in our marriage, described dinners where she felt like I was analyzing rather than connecting, described lying awake at night next to me and feeling like there was an invisible wall between us. And then, gradually, she began comparing that emptiness to the aliveness she felt when talking to him, telling him that their conversations made her feel awake, made her feel interesting again, made her feel like more than someone's wife. The escalation was methodical and unmistakable. Daily good morning messages, turning into late-night exchanges that stretched past midnight, small compliments about her writing or her ideas, turning into statements about how radiant she seemed, how different she looked when she was animated, how he could imagine what it would be like to sit across from her with no one else in the room. And each step followed a pattern I have explained to countless couples. Emotional intimacy first, secrecy second, justification third. There were explicit acknowledgments of concealment, references to deleting messages, to keeping notifications off her phone, to making sure conversation stayed on the tablet, because it was less obvious. And reading those lines, I felt a slow, cold clarity settle over me. The understanding that this was not an accidental drift, but a constructed parallel bond. What struck me most was how she framed me in those messages, not as a villain, but as a void, describing me as competent, reliable, stable, yet emotionally distant, as if I were a well-built house that lacked warmth. And Travis leaned into that narrative, never attacking me directly, but amplifying her dissatisfaction, reinforcing the idea that she deserved more, deserved to feel chosen and understood. I could see the reinforcement loop forming, her sharing a doubt, him validating it, her sharing something deeper the next time, him responding with greater intensity, and eventually she wrote that she felt more alive talking to him than she had felt in years, that their conversations reminded her of who she used to be before everything became routine. I did not cry while reading it, and I did not shout, because the part of me that has sat with betrayal stories for over a decade was cataloging rather than reacting, noting timestamps, frequency, the consistency of daily contact, the shift from friendly to intimate language around the 6-week mark, the first explicit comparison between him and me around week 9, the first statement about feeling invisible in our marriage shortly after that. I stood in my own kitchen with the tablet in my hands and felt the surreal weight of recognizing every dynamic at play, understanding exactly how this attachment had formed, and knowing with devastating certainty that I was not just her husband in that moment, but a case study unfolding in real time. Travis Reed had been my client in 2021, sitting across from me in a leather chair that still bears the faint scratch marks from anxious hands, after his wife left him for her supervisor at the marketing firm where she worked, and I remember those sessions with uncomfortable clarity, because he was not simply grieving the end of his marriage, but fixated on the humiliation of it, on the idea that another man had stepped into his life and replaced him. And in our final sessions, he spoke obsessively about revenge, not in the crude sense of confrontation, but in the colder sense of wanting someone else to feel the same devastation he felt, describing in painstaking detail how unfair it was that he had to carry that pain alone while his ex-wife seemed to move on untouched. I had worked carefully to redirect that thinking, explaining the corrosive nature of revenge fantasies, guiding him toward acceptance rather than retaliation. And when he terminated therapy, he seemed stable enough, wounded but functional, and I closed his file believing I had helped him move forward rather than feed the darker parts of himself. Reading his messages to Lauren years later felt like discovering a blueprint had been preserved and quietly repurposed, because what I saw was not random flirtation or accidental emotional overlap, but calculated vulnerability. A man who understood exactly how to present himself as safe while subtly reshaping the narrative around him. He mirrored her insecurities with almost surgical precision, responding to her fears of becoming invisible with stories about how his ex-wife once made him feel overlooked, aligning himself with her in shared victimhood. And each time Lauren expressed doubt about her value, he answered not with overt seduction, but with gentle reinforcement that positioned me as the distant figure in the background. He never attacked me directly, which would have been obvious and crude, but he planted subtle digs disguised as empathy, statements like it must be hard being married to someone who spends all day analyzing emotions, or sometimes the strongest men forget to be present at home, lines crafted to sound reflective rather than accusatory. Yet each one nudged her further into a comparison that favored him. The most chilling moment came when I scrolled to the part of the thread where she finally acknowledged who he was, where she wrote that she had realized he used to see me professionally and that she felt strange about it. And I watched his response unfold in real time through saved screenshots, how he expressed surprise, but not discomfort, how he framed it as fate or coincidence, how he assured her that their connection existed independently of my role in his life. And that was the point where any plausible deniability ended. If she had cut contact then, if she had recognized the ethical minefield and stepped back, I might have been able to attribute the entire situation to manipulation, to a man exploiting her emotional openness. But she did not step back. She continued messaging him for weeks afterward, sometimes more frequently than before, and in that continuation, she crossed a line that cannot be erased by claiming confusion or vulnerability, because she knew exactly who he was and exactly what the dynamic represented. From that point forward, every message carried the weight of choice, and she chose daily to confide in him about her panic attacks while telling me she was simply stressed from work. She chose to describe doubts about motherhood, about whether she would ever feel fully prepared or fully satisfied, confessions she never voiced in our kitchen or bedroom. And she chose to articulate fears of aging, of fading attractiveness, of feeling like her best years were behind her, all while assuring me that she was just tired and needed more sleep. I could see the duality laid out in timestamps, her telling him at 11:42 p.m. that she felt old and unseen, and then turning to me minutes later in bed and saying she was exhausted from a long day at the foundation. What unsettled me most was not only that she shared these intimate fragments with him, but that she curated a version of me within those conversations that justified her secrecy, presenting me as competent yet emotionally unavailable, attentive to clients but inattentive at home. And Travis reinforced that narrative with carefully measured sympathy. He positioned himself as the one who truly listened, the one who noticed her subtle shifts in mood, the one who understood her layered fears, and he did it all without ever overtly declaring himself superior, because he did not need to. The contrast was implied in every exchange. Watching it unfold was like analyzing a slow-moving psychological operation in which both participants benefited, he from proximity to the man he once envied and perhaps resented, and she from the thrill of being deeply understood without the accountability of confronting me directly. By the time I finished reviewing those weeks of messages, any illusion that this was a one-sided manipulation had dissolved, because complicity is measured not in a single dramatic act, but in repeated, conscious decisions. And she made those decisions every day, typing out her fears, accepting his validation, deleting notifications, and returning to our shared life as though nothing had shifted. I had spent years teaching couples that betrayal begins long before physical boundaries are crossed, and now I was staring at a record of that exact progression, written in the voice of my wife and a former client who once swore he would never let himself be humiliated again. When I finally confronted her in early November, it was not in the kitchen or the bedroom, where emotion might have swallowed structure, but in my home office, the same room where I've spent years helping other couples dismantle their illusions. And she stood in the doorway with her arms folded loosely across her chest, asking why I had pulled away and why I would not touch her anymore. Her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and irritation, as if my distance were an inexplicable mood rather than the consequence of something documented and deliberate. I did not raise my voice, and I did not pace, because anger would have diluted the precision of what I needed to say. And instead I sat behind my desk and told her I had read everything, every message, every deleted notification restored for backups, every late-night confession she thought existed in a private space beyond our marriage. I watched her face change, not in one dramatic shift, but in subtle stages, first confusion, then realization, then a tightening around her eyes that signaled calculation, and I began reciting specific dates and quotes the way I would present a timeline in a case consultation. I told her that on October 3rd at 11:17 p.m., she told Travis she felt more emotionally connected to him than she had to me in years, that she wrote she felt understood in ways she no longer did at home, and that she ended that message with a heart emoji she has not used with me in months. I told her that on October 21st she admitted she checked her phone for his messages before checking on me when I came home late from work, that she described hearing my car in the driveway and feeling a flicker of irritation because it interrupted her conversation with him, and that she followed it by saying she sometimes wished time would freeze when they were talking. She tried to interrupt, saying it was not what it sounded like, that it was just venting, that everyone needs someone to talk to. But I continued calmly, explaining how on multiple occasions she referred to their conversations as the highlight of her day, how she described lying next to me while replaying something he said, how she acknowledged feeling guilty, yet choosing to continue, because she felt alive in those exchanges. I told her that I had watched the escalation from friendly support to intimate confession, that I had seen her share details about her panic attacks with him before mentioning them to me, that she wrote about fears of aging and doubts about motherhood to him, while telling me she was simply tired from work. And I did not accuse her with emotion, but with documentation, placing each example in chronological order until the pattern was impossible to deny. She insisted nothing physical happened, repeating that it was just talking, just messages, just words on a screen, and she said it as though the absence of physical contact rendered the betrayal theoretical. And I listened to her defense with a strange detachment of someone who has heard the same argument across countless couches. I explained to her that as someone who counsels couples through affairs, I have seen marriages survive one-time physical mistakes when both parties confront them honestly, but I have also seen marriages collapse under the weight of sustained emotional intimacy redirected outside the relationship. Because emotional intimacy is the infrastructure of partnership, the daily investment of vulnerability, attention, and loyalty. I told her that when she chose to share her fears, her longing, her resentment, and her sense of aliveness with another man while presenting me with a sanitized, distant version of herself, she was not merely talking, she was reallocating attachment. I described how emotional affairs often feel harmless to the person engaged in them because they lack the tangible evidence of physical contact, yet they erode trust more profoundly because they involve sustained deception, intentional secrecy, and the gradual shifting of emotional reliance from one partner to another. I told her that every time she deleted a notification, every time she angled her phone away, every time she told me she was exhausted while staying up to message him, she was choosing him over the transparency that marriage requires. I did not shout because shouting would have allowed her to frame this as my anger rather than her actions. And instead I maintained a steady tone, outlining how betrayal is defined not solely by physical boundaries, but by the diversion of intimacy, by the creation of a parallel emotional world that excludes the spouse. She stood there in my office, the same office where I have helped others rebuild shattered trust. And for a moment neither of us moved, the air thick with a weight of specifics that could not be argued away, and I realized that the most devastating part of confronting her was not the evidence itself, but the clarity with which I understood exactly what she had done and exactly how deliberate it had been. She claimed she ended it the night I left the apartment, her voice unsteady but deliberate, as if presenting a final piece of evidence meant to soften the narrative, and she said she sent him a message telling him it was over, that she needed to focus on her marriage, that she could not continue something that was hurting us, and I listened without interrupting because I had already learned that timing reveals more than intention. When she finished, I asked her quietly whether she would have ended it if I had never found out, and the room went still in a way that felt heavier than any argument we had had, because that question did not require analysis or justification. It required honesty about motive. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it, her eyes drifting to the bookshelf behind me, and that silence stretched long enough to answer itself, confirming what I already understood on a level deeper than anger, that she did not choose our marriage first. She chose exposure control. In my profession, I have seen that distinction play out repeatedly, the difference between remorse born of empathy and remorse born of discovery. And as I watched her struggle to produce a response that did not exist, I felt something inside me shift from wounded to resolved. If she had ended it out of clarity, out of a renewed commitment, out of an internal recognition that what she was building was incompatible with our vows, there would have been a narrative she could articulate, a moment of realization she could describe, but there was none. The ending was reactive, not reflective, and that realization stripped away whatever fragile hope I might have been unconsciously holding. I asked her directly whether during those conversations she ever thought I wished this was Mason instead of Travis, whether at any point while she was sharing her fears, her longings, her doubts about aging and motherhood, she paused and redirected that vulnerability toward me in her mind. And she did not deflect this time. She admitted she felt like she was finally experiencing something she had been missing, that talking to him felt effortless, that she did not feel analyzed or evaluated, that she felt chosen in a way she had not felt in years. She said it without cruelty, almost as if she were describing a discovery about herself rather than an injury to me. And that was the moment I emotionally detached completely, not in anger, but in clarity. Hearing her frame it as an experience she had been deprived of within our marriage altered something fundamental, because it meant she had not simply sought attention during a vulnerable period. She had redefined connection without me. She had constructed a version of intimacy that excluded my presence, not because I was incapable of it, but because she had stopped associating me with that possibility. In her messages, she had described feeling alive, feeling understood, feeling seen, and now she was acknowledging that those sensations were not accidental, but desired, cultivated, and compared against what she perceived as absence in our relationship. I realized then that the betrayal was not only in the secrecy or the emotional disclosures, but in the recalibration of her internal compass. The decision to measure fulfillment against an external source rather than confront dissatisfaction within our shared space. As someone who has guided couples through repair, I know that reconciliation requires a return to the marriage as the primary arena of vulnerability, a conscious choice to reinvest where damage occurred. But in that office, as she spoke about finally experiencing something she felt had been missing, I understood that she had not merely stepped outside the boundary, she had relocated her sense of connection altogether. The detachment I felt was not dramatic or visible. There was no raised voice or slammed door, but it was decisive, a quiet internal recognition that the marriage I thought I was defending no longer existed in the way I believed it did. Her silence about whether she would have ended it, her admission that she felt something essential with him, formed a clarity sharper than anger, and I understood that what I was confronting was not a lapse but a redefinition, and that realization left very little to hold on to. I moved in temporarily with my older brother Ethan in Seattle for 2 weeks to gain distance, not as a dramatic separation, but as a deliberate pause, a controlled removal from the environment where every room carried the residue of what I had learned, and the drive north felt strangely quiet despite the traffic, as if my mind had exhausted its capacity for outrage and settled instead into observation. Ethan did not interrogate me when I arrived. He simply cleared space in his guest room and handed me a spare key, and in that uncomplicated gesture there was a steadiness I had not felt in my own home for months. The physical distance gave me something I had been missing, perspective unclouded by daily routines, by shared meals, by the reflexive familiarity of her presence. During that time, Lauren began individual therapy, and she made sure I knew it, forwarding me appointment confirmations and later sending long written explanations that read almost like reflective essays, outlining her internal landscape with impressive psychological vocabulary. She wrote about feeling pressured to be the perfect therapist's wife, about the unspoken expectation to embody emotional intelligence at all times, about the weight of presenting a stable, supportive marriage because she believed my professional reputation depended on our image. She described growing up with emotionally distant parents who valued achievement over affection, who modeled composure rather than vulnerability, and she traced a line from that childhood to her adult tendency to perform happiness, to curate a version of herself that seemed fulfilled even when she felt restless. Clinically, her insight made sense, and I could see the coherence in her narrative, the way unmet attachment needs can resurface in adulthood, the way role expectations can become suffocating when they're never examined aloud. She articulated how she felt invisible not because I ignored her intentionally, but because she had internalized a belief that expressing dissatisfaction would destabilize the structure we had built, and she claimed that talking to Travis felt easier because he did not occupy the role of husband, because he represented possibility rather than responsibility. As a therapist, I could map the dynamics she described onto familiar frameworks, attachment theory, emotional deprivation schemas, the pursuit of validation outside rigid roles. But psychological explanation does not erase behavioral choice. And while her analysis illuminated why she might have felt vulnerable to external validation, it did not undo the months she chose secrecy over honesty. Every time she opened that message thread, instead of opening a conversation with me, she exercised agency, not compulsion. Every time she deleted notifications, curated her language, and reassured me that she was simply tired from work, she reinforced a parallel attachment that she knew, at least on some level, would devastate me if discovered. Insight may contextualize behavior, but it does not absolve it. In Seattle, sitting at Ethan's kitchen table early in the morning while he left for work, I allowed myself to examine my own contribution without defensiveness. I had become complacent, overly absorbed in my practice, emotionally fatigued at the end of long days spent holding other people's pain. I had allowed routine to replace intentional connection, assuming stability was synonymous with health. There were evenings when I answered emails instead of asking her how she was really feeling, weekends when I prioritized case preparation over shared experiences, and I can acknowledge that I did not always show up with the curiosity and presence that intimacy requires. Yet even within that acknowledgement, there was a boundary I could not cross in self-blame. I had not sought emotional validation from another woman. I had not constructed a private world of affirmation to compensate for dissatisfaction. I had not shared my fears, my fatigue, or my longing with someone outside our marriage while presenting Lauren with a diluted version of myself. Complacency is a flaw that can be confronted and corrected within the relationship, but deliberate secrecy is a different category altogether. She actively built a parallel attachment knowing, given who I am and what I do for a living, exactly the kind of damage it could cause. The 2 weeks in Seattle were not filled with dramatic revelations, but with quiet recalibration, long walks through damp streets, evenings spent reading rather than replaying messages, and gradual recognition that while her explanations were thoughtful and even sincere, they operated on a different axis than the injury itself. Understanding why she felt unseen did not negate the fact that she chose to be seen elsewhere. Acknowledging my emotional fatigue did not transform her sustained deception into a momentary lapse. Distance clarified that empathy for her internal struggle could coexist with accountability for her actions, and that those two truths did not cancel each other out. When I returned home, unannounced, the air inside the apartment felt different before I even set my bag down, as if the space itself had been edited, and within seconds I understood why. Because the walls that once held framed photographs of us hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, laughing at a friend's wedding, leaning into each other at the coast, were now covered with abstract prints and muted tones, impersonal shapes meant to signal neutrality rather than history. The furniture had been rearranged, the couch angled toward a different wall, the armchairs separated instead of paired, the coffee table centered with deliberate symmetry, as if the room had been staged for a real estate listing rather than lived in by two people whose marriage was in crisis. It looked like a reset, a visual attempt to scrub away the narrative of us and replace it with something emotionally safer, something that did not accuse. She came out of the bedroom when she heard the door close, surprise flashing across her face before it softened into something that looked like hope. And for a moment we stood in that redesigned living room like strangers evaluating a space neither fully recognized. We sat down, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the gravity of the conversation that had been building for weeks, and she began speaking almost immediately, telling me she had been trying to create a new atmosphere, a symbolic clean slate, a way to demonstrate that she was serious about change. Her voice trembled as she described therapy sessions where she unpacked her need for validation. where she confronted the discomfort of admitting she had betrayed not only me, but her own stated values. And then she leaned forward and asked me to hold her, not casually, but urgently, as if physical closeness could function as proof that something still existed between us. She said if I could just hold her, if I could let my guard down for a moment, it would show that there was something left to salvage, that beneath the anger and documentation and analysis there was still connection, and I watched her hands move toward mine before stopping, hovering in the space between us. I told her quietly that I could not touch her, not because I wanted to punish her or because I was incapable of empathy, but because she had already given the most vulnerable version of herself to someone else while offering me performance. I told her that for months I had been living beside a curated version of her, the efficient partner, the supportive spouse, the woman who asked about my sessions and kissed me goodbye while directing her deepest fears and longings elsewhere. I explained that physical touch requires a baseline of emotional safety, and that safety had been dismantled not in a single impulsive moment, but in daily choices to invest intimacy outside our marriage. She cried when I said it, not loudly, but with a contained grief that mirrored my own restraint, and she repeated that nothing physical had happened, as though the absence of contact between their bodies might restore the integrity of ours. I told her that intimacy is not measured solely in proximity of skin, but in the allocation of truth, and that she had relocated her truth. The decision to file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, did not feel dramatic when I signed the papers. It felt procedural, almost anticlimactic after the emotional excavation of the previous weeks, and yet it carried a finality that no conversation had achieved. I did not cite infidelity in explicit terms because the legal language did not require it, and because reducing what happened to a single category felt insufficient to capture its complexity. Shortly after filing, I learned through professional channels that Travis had lost his license to facilitate support groups due to ethical violations involving vulnerable members, information that circulated quietly among colleagues who monitor professional conduct. The details were not mine to dissect publicly, but the pattern was clear enough to confirm what I had already suspected about the predatory nature of his behavior, about the way he positioned himself as safe while exploiting emotional exposure. That confirmation provided a grim kind of validation, a reassurance that my assessment of him had not been purely personal bias. But it did not absolve Lauren's choices, because predatory behavior requires opportunity and participation. And while he may have engineered the dynamic with calculated empathy, she remained responsible for the doors she opened and the intimacy she sustained. The apartment with its abstract prints and rearranged furniture became a metaphor for what we could not rebuild, a space redesigned to suggest renewal, but stripped to the shared history that once gave it meaning. And I understood that no aesthetic reset could compensate for the version of us that no longer existed. By January, I had moved into a smaller apartment in Denver, a one-bedroom space with high ceilings and bare white walls that felt more like a temporary studio than a home. And the altitude did something subtle to my breathing, as if forcing my body to recalibrate along with the rest of my life. I reduced my client load deliberately, not out of burnout, but out of necessity, because continuing to sit with couples 8 hours a day while ignoring my own fractures would have been another form of emotional outsourcing. The quiet of the new apartment made my evenings stretch longer than I was used to, and instead of filling them with distraction, I began writing, not out of ambition but compulsion, drafting a manuscript on emotional authenticity in long-term relationships, dissecting the difference between stability and intimacy, between performance and presence. Writing forced me to confront blind spots I had previously intellectualized but not embodied, the ways I had allowed my professional identity to absorb parts of me that should have remained available at home, the subtle arrogance of believing that because I understood relational dynamics conceptually, I was immune to neglecting them personally. I examined how often I returned from sessions emotionally saturated, defaulting to silence rather than vulnerability, assuming that competence was a sufficient substitute for connection. I acknowledged that I had outsourced fragments of myself to my career, investing emotional labor into clients with disciplined consistency while offering Lauren a more fatigued version of my interior life. That reckoning did not excuse what she had done, but it prevented me from rewriting the narrative in a way that cast me as entirely blameless. Months later, I attended a public lecture on resilience after relational trauma, partly out of curiosity and partly because I was trying to expose myself to perspectives outside my own echo chamber. And that was where I met Hannah Brooks. She spoke openly about rebuilding her life after divorce, not with bitterness but with clarity, describing how she had mistaken endurance for intimacy in her previous marriage, how she learned that transparency is not a personality trait, but a daily discipline. There was nothing theatrical about her delivery, No attempt to dramatize pain for effect. And when we spoke afterward, the conversation unfolded without the guarded subtext I had grown accustomed to navigating. Instead of editing my history into something more palatable, I told her directly that my marriage ended because my wife chose to give her emotional intimacy to someone else instead of fighting for us. And I said it without embellishment or venom. I described how secrecy corrodes connection, how performance masquerades as stability, and how I had participated in that performance longer than I realized. She did not flinch or rush to reassure me. She simply listened and then shared her own account of misalignment and delayed honesty. And for the first time since the separation, I felt something grounded and real, not dramatic, not reactive, not defined by comparison to the past. The sensation was almost unfamiliar, a steadiness rather than a surge, an exchange where words did not feel like strategic positioning, but like simple truth. There was no urgency to prove anything, no attempt to rewrite what had happened, only acknowledgement of it. Walking back to my apartment that night, through cold Denver air, I recognized that what I had mourned most intensely was not the legal end of the marriage, but the illusion that love can survive without radical transparency. I had believed that consistency, shared routines, and outward harmony were sufficient scaffolding, and I now understood that without sustained honesty, even the most well-constructed partnership becomes hollow. The smaller apartment no longer felt temporary in that moment. It felt intentional, a space aligned with who I was becoming rather than who I had been trying to maintain. I realized that authenticity is not simply the absence of deception, but the active presence of truth, spoken before resentment calcifies and before external validation becomes seductive. The loss of the marriage was real, but the deeper loss had been my belief that love endures on autopilot, that it can be sustained by reputation and routine alone. Standing there with a clarity that comes only after something breaks, I understood that the future I wanted would require more courage than performance ever did, and that for the first time in months, I was no longer living in two realities at once.